You stand there looking innocent after what you've done. Look at this phone. Look at it. How could you betray my trust like this?
Tochukwu, please, just let me see the phone. I don't understand what you think I did, but it's not true.
How could you do this to me? Look, it's right here. These messages don't lie, Chinwe. Explain this.
Tochukwu, I swear to you, I don't know what you're talking about. Why won't you believe me? I would never do this to us.
Explain this. Who is Daniel? Tell me now.
I swear I didn't do this. I don't know where that came from, Tochukwu. Please, just let me see what it says.
The apartment held the particular kind of quiet that follows a sentence too large to answer quickly. Outside, Abuja moved through an ordinary evening, indifferent to the 5 years that had just folded themselves into a single room. Some doors take that long to find the right key, even when the key had been sitting forgotten inside an old phone the entire time. To understand how a marriage built on love became a courtroom built on a lie, you have to go back to the first months after the wedding, in a quiet estate in Port Harcourt, where two families that should have become one never quite did. Tochukwu Nweke married Chinwe Obi on a bright Saturday in Port Harcourt, in a church his family had attended for 3 generations, with 200 guests and a reception that ran long into the evening. From the outside, nothing about the day suggested what was already quietly true inside it, that his mother, Mrs. Beatrice Nweke, had spent the entire ceremony with a smile arranged carefully enough to pass for genuine and a private fury that her son had married the wrong woman. The reason ran deeper than ordinary disapproval. Years before the wedding, Beatrice's late husband had borrowed a significant sum from his closest friend, a businessman named Chief Okonkwo, to keep the family transport business afloat during a difficult season. The two men had never written the loan down anywhere, trusting instead an old understanding between old friends, an understanding Beatrice had quietly extended after her husband's death, by promising, in conversations she never repeated in front of witnesses, that the debt would dissolve naturally once their two families became one, once Tochukwu married Chief Okonkwo's daughter, Ogechi. When Tochukwu announced instead that he intended to marry a girl from a civil servant's family in Owerri, a girl with no connection to Chief Okonkwo at all, Beatrice understood immediately what it would cost her, not only in pride, but in an outstanding debt with no paper trail, and an old friend who now had every right to feel publicly humiliated. She never told her son any of this. She only began, from the very first month of the engagement, to make Chinwe pay quietly for an arrangement Chinwe had never even known existed. The cruelty did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most lasting damage does, in a long accumulation small enough to deny and large enough, over time, to wear a person down to nothing. In the first year, Beatrice controlled the household money with a precision that left Chinwe asking permission for things a wife in any ordinary household would never have had to ask for: transport fare, hairdressing money, even the cost of fabric for a dress to wear to her own brother's wedding. When Chinwe tried, quietly, to keep a small portion of her own salary aside once she finally secured a junior accounting position, Beatrice told Tochukwu that a wife who hid money from her husband's house was a wife already planning her exit, and Tochukwu, still new to marriage, and still deeply loyal to a mother who had raised him alone after his father's death, began asking Chinwe questions about her finances he had never asked before. The public humiliations were worse, and they came often. At her own sister-in-law's naming ceremony, in front of nearly 80 guests, Beatrice announced loudly that she hoped the new wife would eventually learn to cook a proper pot of soup, since the one she had prepared for the occasion had clearly been an embarrassment. A comment delivered with enough volume that the women serving food stopped to look, and enough cruelty that Chinwe excused herself to the bathroom and did not return to the gathering for nearly an hour. The worst of it came in the second year, when Chinwe lost a pregnancy in her 4th month, alone in a hospital room while Tochukwu was traveling for work. Beatrice, informed immediately by a cousin, chose not to visit until the 3rd day, arriving finally only to remark, standing at the foot of the hospital bed, that some women's bodies simply were not built to hold what a marriage required of them, and that perhaps it explained a great deal nobody in the family had wanted to say out loud before now. Chinwe lay there afterward, alone again once the room emptied, and understood, for the first time, the full shape of what she had married into. She did not tell her own family the worst of it, ashamed in a way she could not fully explain even to herself, and increasingly cut off from them besides, since Beatrice had developed a habit of answering the house phone before Chinwe could reach it and reporting afterward that her family had called only briefly, with nothing important to say. A small daily theft of connection that left Chinwe more alone in that house, with each passing month, than she had been in any year of her life before it. By the time the marriage reached its 2nd anniversary, Tochukwu had already begun, almost without noticing it himself, absorbing 2 years of his mother's careful insinuations, small comments about how often Chinwe checked her phone, how late she sometimes stayed at the office, how a man should always watch carefully for the things a wife chose not to mention. He did not yet believe anything was wrong. He had simply, slowly, been taught to look for it. What none of them understood, in that house where one woman suffered quietly and another counted every insult as a small repayment toward an old debt no one else even knew existed, was that an injustice built this carefully does not stay hidden forever simply because its victim never learns the reason for it. It only waits, the way every unpaid debt eventually does, for the day someone finally goes looking for where it actually came from. It began, as far as Chinwe was ever able to reconstruct it, on a weekend when she and Tochukwu traveled to Owerri for her own father's birthday, leaving her old phone charging on the bedroom dresser because she had recently switched to a new line for work and rarely carried the old device anymore. Beatrice, who had kept a key to the house from the years she had helped with errands while the couple worked, used that weekend to do something she had clearly planned for some time. She purchased a second SIM card under a name that was not her own, saved it in Chinwe's old phone under a contact labeled Daniel, and over the following 2 weeks sent herself a series of messages addressed to Chinwe, warm and suggestive, carefully worded to read as the middle of an ongoing affair rather than its beginning, then deleted the obvious gaps and left just enough behind to look discovered rather than constructed. She showed the phone to Tochukwu on a Sunday evening, framing it as something she had stumbled across by accident while searching for an old family photograph, her voice carrying the particular concern of a mother who insists she is only doing this for her son's own good. Tochukwu read the messages twice in front of her, his face changing in a way Chinwe would replay in her memory for years afterward. He did not call Chinwe first. He called his cousin Emeka, then his closest friend from secondary school, narrating the discovery to each of them before he ever said a single word to his own wife about it. When he finally confronted her, 2 days later, Chinwe denied it the only way an innocent person can, completely and without the practiced calm of someone managing a lie. She did not know anyone named Daniel. She had no memory of the conversations on the screen in front of her. She asked, repeatedly, where the phone had been for the past 2 weeks, and was told only that it had been with his mother, who had merely found what was already there. Tochukwu chose, in the end, to believe the evidence in his hand over the wife standing in front of him, a choice that would take him 5 years to fully understand the weight of. The divorce proceedings began within the month. Nobody in either family asked very many questions about how a phone holding a hidden affair had come so conveniently into Beatrice's hands in the first place. What none of them understood that Sunday evening, sitting in a living room with a phone passed silently between three people, was that evidence built on a lie does not stay buried as easily as the person who built it hopes. It only waits, quietly, in deleted folders and old data, for someone with the right reason to go looking. The story moved through both families faster than Chinwe could have contained it, arriving in its cruelest version first, the one where the quiet, polite daughter-in-law from Owerri had been carrying on with another man for months behind a good man's back. Aunts who had once praised her cooking at family gatherings now found reasons to look past her at the same gatherings. Her own mother, hearing the story secondhand before Chinwe could explain it herself, called in a tone heavier with disappointment than support, asking only how she could have let this happen to a marriage everyone had been so proud of. Chinwe did not fight the story in public. She had already learned, in the space of one terrible week, that arguing with a version of events the room had already accepted only attached your name to it more firmly. She packed her belongings into her brother's car on a Thursday afternoon, said goodbye to a house she had lived in for 3 years, and watched it disappear behind her without any of the ceremony a marriage's ending might once have seemed to deserve. Her father stood at the gate of his own house when she arrived in Owerri, not with judgment, but with the particular helplessness of a man who did not know how to fix something that had broken outside his sight. She did not stay in Owerri long. 3 months later, with a small severance from the accounting job she had only just started and never been allowed to properly begin, she moved to Abuja, a city large enough that no one there had any reason to already know her story. She found a single room in Wu Zone 6, paid for by savings that would last her perhaps 4 careful months, and began again from a place lower than anywhere she had stood before. On the nights she sat alone in that room replaying the conversation with Tochukwu, searching for anything she could have said differently, she reminded herself, slowly, that disgrace borrowed from someone else's lie was not the same thing as guilt, even when it felt exactly the same. Chinwe's first job in Abuja was answering phones and resetting passwords at a small IT support firm tucked into a strip of shops near Wuse Market, a role she took because it was the only interview that turned into an offer within her first 6 weeks in the city. She had no real background in technology. Only a determination, sharpened by everything that had happened in Port Harcourt, to understand exactly how a phone could be made to lie convincingly enough to end a marriage. The owner of the firm, an engineer named Hassan Bello, noticed her within the first month, not because she was the fastest worker, but because she stayed late asking questions none of the other support staff bothered to ask, about metadata, about how deleted messages could sometimes be recovered, about how a determined person might construct evidence that looked, to an untrained eye, indistinguishable from the truth. He began, almost without deciding to, teaching her properly, first the basics of system logs, then the principles of digital forensics, the discipline of tracing where data actually came from rather than where it appeared to live. She absorbed all of it with the same quiet intensity she had once brought to a marriage she could not save, as though understanding the mechanism of what had happened to her might somehow retroactively prove she had never deserved it. Across town, in a story she knew nothing about, Tochukwu was discovering a different kind of education. The slow realization that a marriage ended on the strength of his mother's word and a single damning phone had left him with a silence in his own house that no amount of being right could fill. He did not remarry. He told people, when they asked, that he had simply not found the right person, never mentioning that some quiet part of him had begun, in the years after the divorce, to wonder about a question he had once been too certain to ask. After 18 months, Hassan Bello put Chinwe in charge of her first real case, a small business owner convinced an employee had falsified expense records and watched her trace the manipulated entries back to their actual origin with a precision he later told colleagues he had rarely seen in someone so early in the field. Within 2 years, she had earned a recognized certification in digital forensics, the kind regional law firms and corporate investigators had begun, slowly, to call her directly for. There was a case, near the end of her second year, that Hassan Bello still mentioned to other clients when he wanted to illustrate what careful work actually looked like. A dispute between two business partners, where one insisted a contract amendment had been signed weeks earlier than it actually had been. Chinwe spent 4 days tracing file metadata across 3 different devices before she found the inconsistency that proved the document had been backdated, a discovery that ended the dispute within a single afternoon once she presented it. She did not think, at the time, about how much that particular skill, finding the small inconsistency a confident liar had not bothered to hide carefully enough, would have changed everything in a living room in Port Harcourt 5 years earlier. By the 4th year, Chinwe had moved on to a larger digital forensics consultancy serving banks and telecom companies across Abuja and Lagos, carrying with her the same unglamorous discipline that had carried her through every difficult year since the divorce, checking every detail twice, trusting nothing that had not been verified against its actual source. Engineer Bello, when she left, told her only that he had taught her everything he knew within the first 2 years, and that everything since had been entirely her own. She did not celebrate any of it loudly. She returned each evening to her own small apartment, now considerably more comfortable than the room she had started in, and allowed herself, on the nights that mattered most, one quiet moment of something that resembled proof that the thing taken from her in Port Harcourt had not, in fact, taken everything. In the 5th year after the divorce, the story in Port Harcourt that no one had questioned closely enough finally began, in small ways, to come apart at its edges. Mrs. Beatrice Nweke, now in her late 60s, suffered a mild stroke on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, weak enough to frighten the family, but not severe enough to take her speech or her memory, leaving her instead with a long recovery and an unusual amount of time alone with her own thoughts. Tochukwu, who had moved back into his mother's house temporarily to help during her recovery, found himself, for the first time in years, sorting through drawers and old devices that had not been touched since before the divorce, looking for family photographs to keep his mother occupied during the long afternoons of physiotherapy. Among the things he found was an old phone of his mother's, one she had stopped using years earlier, its battery long dead, its data untouched since the year everything had ended. He took it, along with 2 others, to a small repair shop near the estate, intending only to recover whatever photographs the device still held, with no particular reason to expect anything else. In Abuja, Chinwe knew none of this. She had built, over 5 careful years, a life that no longer required Port Harcourt's permission to feel complete, a senior position at a respected firm, a small apartment furnished slowly and entirely to her own taste, and a quiet circle of friends who knew her only as the calm, exacting woman who had built her career from nothing in a city that had not been kind to her at first. She had stopped, mostly, wondering what had happened to the marriage she once had. The wondering simply cost more than it ever returned. What she did not know, on an ordinary Wednesday in Abuja while she reviewed a client's compromised email server, was that 300 kilometers away, a repair technician in Port Harcourt was about to recover a folder of deleted messages that would finally end the only open question her old life had left unanswered. The technician, more interested in retrieving the photographs Tochukwu had actually asked for, ran a standard data recovery tool across the old phone without much expectation of finding anything unusual. What it returned, alongside several hundred recovered family pictures, was a folder of deleted text threads, complete with timestamps, the original SIM registration details, and message drafts that had never quite been sent in their final, more convincing form. Tochukwu did not understand, at first, what he was looking at. The contact name read Daniel. The same name burned into a memory he had spent 5 years trying not to revisit. But the timestamps told a different story than the one he remembered. Messages composed and revised across a 2-week window, draft versions saved alongside their final edits, all of it sent from a second SIM card the recovery tool traced back to a number purchased. According to the registration data, the technician was able to pull, under his own mother's identification. He sat with the phone in his hands for a long time before he allowed himself to fully understand what it meant. The affair that had ended his marriage had never existed outside of a folder his mother built over 2 careful weeks, in a phone she had access to only because she still held a key to a house that, at the time, had not yet stopped being his and Chinwe's together. He confronted his mother that same evening, sitting at her bedside while her recovery equipment hummed quietly in the background, and watched something in her composed, careful face finally give way under the weight of a truth she had clearly hoped would stay buried with the device itself. She did not deny it for long. She told him, through tears that surprised them both, that she had only wanted him to choose someone she trusted completely, and that she had convinced herself, across 5 years, that the end had justified whatever method had been required to reach it. Tochukwu left his mother's house that night and did not return for 3 days. When he finally did, he asked her only one question, whether she understood that she had not simply ended a marriage, but had spent 5 years allowing an innocent woman to carry a disgrace that was never hers, while everyone who should have defended her instead chose comfort over truth. Beatrice had no answer that did not sound, even to her, smaller than the question deserved. It took him another 2 weeks, and one conversation with a mutual cousin who happened to know exactly where Chinwe had built her career, before he found the address of a digital forensics consultancy in Abuja and the courage to walk into it without calling ahead first. What followed, when Chinwe's assistant led him into her office without either of them quite believing the coincidence of his timing, was not the conversation either of them had rehearsed in their own private versions of this moment over the years. Tochukwu explained, as steadily as he could manage, what the technician had found, the dates, the registration details, the drafts saved alongside their final versions, laying out evidence with the same kind of clarity. Chinwe herself had spent 5 years learning to demand from every case that crossed her desk. He told her he had confronted his mother, that she had not denied it for long once the proof was placed in front of her, and that he understood now, with a precision that had taken him 5 years too long to reach, that he had chosen his mother's word over his wife's truth without ever once asking for anything that resembled actual proof. Chinwe listened to all of it without interrupting. The same discipline she had built her entire second career on, gathering every fact fully before allowing herself to respond to any of it. When she finally spoke, she did not raise her voice, and she did not let 5 years collapse into anger the way she had once imagined they might, if this moment ever actually arrived. She asked him only why it had taken a stroke and a repair technician to do what she alone had tried and failed to do in a single conversation 5 years earlier, standing in their own living room with nothing but her own word. He did not have a clean answer to that question. He admitted only that he had wanted, in that moment, evidence to be simpler than a wife's denial that his mother's certainty had felt. At the time, like something solid to hold on to in a situation that otherwise offered him nothing solid at all. and that he had not understood until this last difficult week how much damage a person could do by mistaking certainty for truth. Chinwe told him finally that she believed he was genuinely sorry, and that being genuinely sorry after 5 years did not erase the 5 years themselves, only made it possible, finally, to stop carrying them as a question without an answer. Tochukwu asked, carefully, whether there was any way back to what they had once had, a question Chinwe had expected and had already, in the quiet of her own mind, over the previous difficult week, decided how she would answer. She told him she forgave him, and that she meant it fully, not as a performance for his benefit, but because she had learned, in the years since Port Harcourt, that carrying an unresolved hatred for a man and his mother had never once made her own life lighter, only heavier in a different shape. But forgiveness, she explained, was not the same thing as a door swinging back open onto a marriage that had ended the way theirs had. She had built, in Abuja, an entire life that no longer had space shaped for the man who had once chosen his mother's fabricated evidence over 5 years of marriage and a wife standing directly in front of him. Returning to him now would mean asking that life to fold itself backward, and she had spent too many difficult years building it forward to consider that a fair trade for an apology that, however sincere, had arrived 5 years after it could have changed anything that mattered. She told him, too, that the actual betrayal had never only been his mother's fabricated messages, it had been his own choice, in the moment that mattered most, to believe a stranger's name on a screen over the woman who had shared his bed and his name for 3 years, a choice that belonged entirely to him, regardless of what his mother had constructed to make it easier. Tochukwu left her office that afternoon with no promise of anything beyond the truth itself, finally returned to the person it had always belonged to. He told her, before he left, that he understood and that he would carry the cost of that understanding for the rest of his life, whether or not she ever chose to think of him again. That evening, Chinwe called her mother in Owerri, as she had grown accustomed to doing whenever something significant happened in her life, and told her the entire story without leaving out a single detail. Her mother listened until the end, then offered the only judgment that mattered to her, that her daughter had done the right thing, that forgiveness was a gift a person gave themselves, not a debt owed to the person who had caused the harm, and that a marriage built on someone believing the easiest lie over the harder truth had never truly been safe to return to, repaired evidence or not. In Port Harcourt, the story of what Beatrice had done eventually became known across the small circle of family and friends who had once been so quick to judge Chinwe without asking a single hard question of their own. Several of the same aunts who had once looked past her at family gatherings found, in the years that followed, that they had very little to say when her name came up again, not because they regretted nothing, but because there was nothing left to say that did not also implicate themselves. People in that community told the story afterward in different versions, but the ones who told it carefully all arrived at the same understanding that a marriage cannot survive on the comfort of an easy answer when the harder, truer one was standing the entire time directly in front of the person who refused to ask for it. Chinwe's consultancy continued to grow in the years that followed, built one careful case at a time, the same way everything in her life had been built since the year she arrived in Abuja with one room, one chance, and a determination to understand exactly how a lie could be made to look like the truth. She did not remarry quickly, and she did not feel any particular urgency about it. She had learned, in the hardest possible way, that a partner's belief in you mattered more than any evidence either of you could ever produce, and she was no longer willing to settle for less than that, regardless of how long it took to find it. Tochukwu, as she later heard through the same distant family channels that had once carried her disgrace across 2 cities, never remarried either, choosing instead to spend his remaining years caring for a mother whose guilt outlasted her recovery by a long, quiet distance. Some lies take 5 years to unravel. Some marriages are never meant to survive the unraveling. And some truths, once they finally arrive, are valuable simply for arriving at all, regardless of what they are too late to fix. If you stayed with this story until the end, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.